Well, of course I know I'm getting old. But just because one is old, does that mean I should not feel anymore? How can something so wrong feel so, the word again, alive? Margaret was thinking aloud in a confused state. Her voice was shaking in the stillness of her room. The weight of the words hung heavily in the air, as if even the walls were holding their breath. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, and buried her face in her hands. Oh, this wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't supposed to feel this way. But no matter how much she tried to push the thought away, the flutter in her chest told her otherwise. A warmth she hadn't felt in years. A spark she didn't even know she was capable of feeling anymore. She lifted her head, staring blankly at the empty room around her. Is it wrong? Is it wrong to want to feel alive again? She asked aloud, though no one was there to answer. It wasn't just a question. It was the beginning of a storm that would change everything forever. Margaret had always loved her home. Goodness me, it was her sanctuary. A place that had witnessed decades of laughter, celebrations, holidays, and family gathering. But ever since her daughter Mary got married and moved out, the house had grown quiet. Too quiet. The silence wasn't comforting anymore. It felt suffocating. Margaret spent her days tending to the garden, watering the daisies Mary had insisted on planting. Daisies are cheerful like little smiles, Mary had said. Her voice was full of excitement before she left to start her new life with her husband, Michael. Michael? Even the thought of his name made Margaret pause. She hadn't seen much of him after the wedding, but that changed a few weeks when Mary went on a work trip. Michael had started dropping by to check on her, always with a smile and a helping hand. At first, Margaret thought nothing of it. He was just being kind, wasn't he? But lately, his presence had stirred something within her. Something she didn't want to admit. Something that would change their lives forever. That particular afternoon was unusually warm, and Margaret was sitting by the window, sipping a glass of lemonade. The ice cubes clinked against the glass as she absent-mindedly stirred them with a straw. She had been reading a novel, but her attention kept drifting to the splashing sound coming from the backyard. Curious, she peeked out and saw Michael swimming laps in the pool. Her strokes were smooth and powerful, and the water glistened as if cascaded off his toned body. Margaret watched for a moment longer than she should have. Her heart was weakening against her will. Suddenly, Michael looked up and caught her eyes. Margaret froze. Her face was burning with embarrassment. She quickly pretended to adjust the curtain, but it was too late. "Hi, Margaret," Michael called. His voice was cheerful and teasing. "Caught you enjoying the view." Margaret forced a laugh. "Oh, just checking on the daisies," she replied, her voice a little too high-pitched. Michael climbed out of the pool, droplets of water dripping from his hair and shoulders. He grabbed a towel and wrapped it around his waist before walking towards the patio where Margaret sat. "You should join me next time," he said with a grin, shaking water from his hair. "The water is perfect." Margaret chuckled nervously. "I don't think so. Swimming isn't really my thing." Michael sat down across from her, the towel still wrapped around him. "You don't know what you are missing. It's the best way to cool off on a day like this." Margaret tried to focus on the book in her lap, but she could feel his gaze on her. "Well, I will keep that in mind," she said lightly, hoping to steer the conversations elsewhere. Michael leaned back in the chair, his smile softening. "You've done an amazing job keeping this place beautiful, Margaret. Mary always said this house felt like magic because of you." Margaret's heart warmed at his word. "That's kind of you to say, Michael. I just do my best to keep it lively around here. As their conversation flowed, Margaret found herself relaxing. They talked about the garden, Mary's upcoming work trip, and small memories that made them both laugh. But then, their hands brushed as Margaret reached for her glass, and a spark jolted through her. Michael noticed her hesitation. "Are you okay?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "Yes, I'm fine," Margaret replied quickly, her cheeks flushing, just a little tired. Michael didn't push further, but as he left that day, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. Over the next few weeks, Michael's visit became more frequent. At first, Margaret told herself it was nothing, just a kind son-in-law checking in on his mother-in-law while Mary was away. But with each visit, the boundary between them seemed to blur a little more. Michael started finding excuses to stay longer. He would fix a squeaky door, help with the groceries, or join Margaret for tea on the patio. The conversations grew deeper, more personal. Margaret felt herself opening up in ways she hadn't in years. One evening, as they sat together sipping tea, the air was thick with the scent of flowers from the garden, and the atmosphere felt strangely intimate. "Margaret," Michael began, his voice hesitant. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," Margaret replied, though her heart began to race. "Do you ever feel alone?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. Margaret hesitated. The question hit too close to home. "Yes," she admitted softly. "I do, more than I would like to admit." Michael reached out, his hand resting gently on hers. "You don't have to feel that way. You are not alone, Margaret. I am here, all for you." The touch sent a jolt through Margaret, and for a moment, she forgot where she was. She forgot who they were. Before she could stop herself, she leaned in, and their lips met. It was a fleeting, forbidden kiss, but it set her heart racing in a way she hadn't felt in decades. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. She pulled back. Her voice was trembling. "Michael, we can't do this." "I know," he replied, his voice filled with regret. "But I can't pretend I don't feel something." Margaret didn't respond. She couldn't. All she knew was that something had been set in motion, and there was no going back. What began as one kiss quickly turned into something they couldn't control. Margaret and Michael both knew it was wrong, but neither of them had the strength to stop it. They found excuses to see each other, always careful to avoid being noticed. Michael started visiting Margaret more often. Sometimes he would claim he was dropping off groceries. Other times, he would pretend he needed to check on the pool or fix something around the house. Margaret knew she should tell him not to come, but the thought of seeing him made her heart race. One afternoon, Michael showed up with coffee and pastries. "I thought you might like a treat," he said, smiling as he handed her a cup. Margaret hesitated before taking it. "You shouldn't keep coming here," she said softly, though she couldn't help but feel happy that he had. Michael sat down at the table. His expression was serious. "I can't help it, Margaret. I feel like I can talk to you in a way I can't with anyone else, not even my wife Mary." Margaret lowered her gaze, guilt tugging at her heart. "But what about Mary?" she asked. "She trusts both of us. She's my daughter." Michael sighed. "I know. I hate that I'm hurting her, but I can't stop how I feel being with you. It makes me feel alive again." Margaret's hands trembled as she held her cup of coffee. She knew exactly what he meant. For years, she had felt invisible, like her life had lost its spark. But now, every time she saw Michael, she felt like a new person. They began meeting in secret. Michael took her to small cafes in neighboring towns where no one knew them. They sat in the corner, talking for hours about everything and nothing. Sometimes they laughed until their side hurt. Other times, they sat in comfortable silence, simply enjoying each other's company. One evening, Michael suggested they take a walk along the beach. The waves lapped gently at their feet as they strolled along the shore. "You remind me of Mary when she's happy," Michael said suddenly, breaking the silence. Margaret stopped walking and looked at him. compare me to her, she said, her voice trembling. She's your wife. I'm her mother. This isn't right, and I know it, but I just can't help it. I can't stop it. Michael reached for her hand. I know it's wrong, Margaret, but I can't pretend these feelings doesn't exist. Can you? Margaret felt tears well up in her eyes. No, she admitted, but that doesn't make it any less wrong. Their meetings became bittersweet. Margaret treasured every moment they spent together, but the guilt grew heavier with each passing day. She knew they couldn't keep this up. Sooner or later, they would be caught, and the consequences would be devastating. One evening, as they sat in Michael's car, parked under the cover of trees, Margaret finally spoke. This has to stop, she said, her voice trembling. It's not just about us. This will destroy Mary. Michael nodded, his shoulders slumping. I know, he said quietly, but how do we stop it? Margaret shook her head, tears streaming down her face. We have to. If we love her, we have to end this. For a long time, they sat in silence. The weight of their situation pressed down on them like a heavy cloud. Neither of them wanted to leave, but deep down, they both knew it couldn't continue. The illusion they had both created came crashing down on a quiet Sunday afternoon. That particular day, Margaret and Michael were sitting on the couch in the living room. The curtains were drawn and the soft glow of a lamp filled the space with warmth. Margaret was laughing at something Michael had said to her. Her head tilted back as she tried to catch her breath. You have the best laugh, Michael said, smiling at her. It's so genuine. Margaret swatted his arm playfully. Stop flattering me, she said, though her cheeks flushed with warmth. I'm serious, Michael replied, his tone softening. You make me feel like I can just be myself. Before Margaret could respond, the sound of the front door opening froze them both in place. They turned to see Mary standing in the doorway, her arms full of grocery. Her smile faded as her eyes darted between Margaret and her husband, Michael. Mary became so confused, and the confusion was quickly replaced by shock. Mom! Michael! Mary's voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. What's going on? Margaret's heart dropped. Her face turned pale as she struggled to find the words. Mary, Michael sat up straight. His expression was filled with panic. Mary, it's not what you think, he said quickly, even when his own words didn't convince him. Mary dropped the groceries onto the floor, her eyes narrowing. Not what I think, she repeated, her voice trembling with anger. Are you kidding me? I'm not stupid. Margaret stood up. Her hands was trembling. Mary, please listen to me, she begged. It's not. Don't lie to me, Mama. Mary screamed, cutting her off. I trusted you, both of you. How could you do this to me? Michael, you? Oh my God. I can't believe this is happening right now. I need some air. Tears streamed down Mary's face as she took a step back, shaking her head in disbelief. You are my mother, she said, her voice breaking. How could you betray me like this? Margaret felt her own tears falling as she reached out towards Mary. I never meant to hurt you, she said desperately. I'm so sorry. Sorry, Mary repeated. Her voice was dripping with bitterness. Do you think that makes it better? You've destroyed everything, Mama. Michael stood and tried to approach her, his hand raised in a calming gesture. Mary, please, let me explain. Don't touch me, Mary shouted, stepping away from him. I don't want to hear anything from you. Her chest heaved as she tried to steady her breathing. The betrayal in her eyes cut through Margaret like a knife. You were supposed to protect me, Mary said, her voice breaking. Not this, Mama. With that, she turned and stormed out of the house. slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed through the room, leaving Margaret and Michael standing in stunned silence. Margaret sank back onto the couch, her hands covering her face. "What have we done?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael sat beside her, his head in his hand. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I don't know how we fix this." Margaret shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I don't think we can." The weight of their actions pressed down on them like a suffocating cloud. The fantasy they had built, the moment they had shared, all felt meaningless now. For the first time, Margaret truly understood the depth of her betrayal, not just to Mary, but to her own self. The days that followed were some of the hardest Margaret had ever faced in her life. Her home, once a place of comfort, now felt like a prison. The silence inside those walls wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, filled with guilt and regret. Margaret barely left her room. She sat on her bed, staring at the same spot on the floor for hours, replaying the moment Mary walked through the door. Her daughter's face, twisted in anger and betrayal, haunted her. Every time Margaret closed her eyes, she saw Mary's tears and heard her broken voice. "How could you do this to me?" The words echoed over and over in her mind, piercing her heart like a knife. Food lost its taste and sleep became impossible. Every night, Margaret lay awake, her mind racing with thoughts of what she could have done differently. Why didn't I stop this sooner? Why did I let it go this far? The house felt colder without Mary. The warmth of their shared memories was now replaced by the sharp sting of her absence. Margaret longed to hear her daughter's voice, even if it was just the yell at her. Anything was better than this unbearable silence. Michael called several times in the days that followed. Every time his name appeared on her phone, Margaret froze, unable to answer. She knew they needed to talk, but the thought of facing him and herself was too much to bear. She ignored every call, letting them go to voicemail, though she couldn't bring herself to listen to his messages. One evening, there was a knock at the door. Margaret's heart leaped in her chest. For a brief, foolish moment, she thought it might be Mary, but when she opened the door, it was Michael standing there. His eyes were red and swollen. His shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. He looked as broken as Margaret felt. "Margaret," he said softly, his voice trembling, "we need to talk." Margaret hesitated. She wanted to shut the door and avoid these conversations altogether, but she knew she couldn't run forever. She stepped aside, letting him in. They sat in the living room, the dim light from a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words. Finally, Michael broke the silence. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry for everything." Margaret looked at him, her own tears welling up. "I'm sorry too," she said, her voice cracking, "for letting this happen, for hurting Mary." Michael nodded, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I love you, Margaret," he admitted, his voice breaking. "But I love Mary too. I never wanted to hurt either of you." Margaret shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I love you too," she whispered, the confession feeling both freeing and devastating. "But this is wrong. We can't keep doing this." Michael leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "I know," he said, his voice filled with defeat, "but I don't know how to fix this. I don't even know where to start." Margaret sighed, her hands trembling as she clutched a tissue. "The only way to fix this is to stop," she said firmly. "For Mary's sake, for all of us." Michael's shoulders sagged even further. "You are right," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "But that doesn't make it any easier." "It's not supposed to be easy," Margaret replied, her voice trembling. "But it's the only way." For a long time, they sat there in silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The room felt colder than it had before. the weight of their shared guilt pressing down on them like a suffocating blanket. "I'll leave," Michael said finally, his voice barely audible. "I'll give Mary the space she needs. Maybe someday she will be able to forgive me." Margaret nodded, though the thought of never seeing him again felt like a knife twisting in her chest. "I hope she can forgive us both," she said softly. "But even if she doesn't, we have to let her heal." Michael stood, his movements slow and heavy, as if every step took all his strength. He turned to Margaret, his eyes filled with sadness. "Take care of yourself," he said quietly. "Goodbye, Margaret." "Goodbye, Michael," Margaret replied, her voice breaking. As the door closed behind him, Margaret felt an overwhelming sense of loss. She had let him go, and with him went the spark that had made her feel alive again. But she knew it was the right thing to do, the only thing to do. The affair was over, but the consequences of their actions were only beginning. Margaret spent weeks trying to rebuild her relationship with Mary. Every day she picked up the phone, leaving tearful voicemail that echoed with regret and desperation. "Mary, it's me again. I just want you to know how sorry I am. I love you more than anything in this world, and I will give anything to undo the hurt I've caused you. Please call me back when you're ready," Margaret said one evening, her voice cracking under the weight of her guilt. The silence that followed after hanging up each call was unbearable. Margaret replayed memories of Mary as a little girl, laughing in the garden, holding her hands on the first day of school, and later sharing secrets over late-night cups of tea. How had she let herself betray the one person who had always trusted her? Mary didn't respond at first. Weeks turned into months, and Margaret felt the ache of loneliness creeping back into her life. But she didn't give up. She sent handwritten letters, dropped off meals at Mary's doorstep, and even asked Mary's friend to let her know she was thinking of her. One rainy afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Margaret opened it to see Mary standing there, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Margaret's heart leaped with both relief and apprehension. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Mary said, her voice trembling. Margaret's throat tightened. She fought back tears and replied softly, "I don't expect you to, but I need you to know how sorry I am. I love you, Mary, more than anything." Mary looked at her mother, the pain etched on her face, and nodded. "I don't know where we go from here, but I need to hear that." It wasn't an immediate reconciliation, but it was a start. Over the following months, mother and daughter began to rebuild their relationship, brick by brick. There were countless tearful conversations, moments of anger, and days when Mary wanted to walk away again. But Margaret remained patient, giving Mary the space she needed to heal. In the process, Margaret learned to confront her loneliness without crossing boundaries. She began to find peace in her own company and rediscover the strength that had always been within her. Mary, too, learned to set firm boundaries and protect her heart while slowly allowing trust to grow again. Though their bond would never be the same, it became something new, fragile but honest, and perhaps stronger because of it. Margaret never saw Michael again after that day. He moved out shortly after the confrontation, leaving Mary to grapple with the wreckage of their marriage. They tried to salvage what they could, attending counselings and having difficult conversations, but the trust between them was irreparably broken. Eventually, Mary made the painful decisions to end the relationship. Margaret blamed herself for the outcome. She had not only hurt her daughter, but had also contributed to the loss of a future Mary had worked so hard to build. The weight of that realization stayed with her, shaping every decision she made moving forward. Determined to never let loneliness drive her to hurt the people she loved again, Margaret sought solace in helping others. She began volunteering at a local shelter, spending her days listening to stories of people who had lost their way, but were trying to rebuild. In their struggles, she found reflections of her own, and in helping them, she found healing. The spark she had felt with Michael, the rush of being seen, desired and cherished, was something she now replaced with a quieter, more fulfilling sense of purpose. It wasn't the same, but it was real, and it was enough. Margaret often thought of Mary, hoping that one day her daughter would find love again. She cherished the moments they spent together now, even if they were fewer than before. She knew the road to forgiveness was long, but she was willing to walk it no matter how difficult it was. Margaret's story is a reminder that life is full of temptations and fleeting moments of desire, but those moments come with consequences. Love, trust, and family are fragile, and crossing boundaries can leave lasting scars. If you were in Margaret's place, could you forgive yourself? Or, if you were Mary, could you forgive your mother? How would you rebuild trust after such a betrayal? This story also shows that even in the aftermath of mistakes, there is room for growth and redemption. Margaret learned that while loneliness can be overwhelming, the choices we make in those moments can define who we are. Have you ever faced a situation where someone close to you crossed a boundary? How did you navigate it? We'd love to hear your story. Let's learn from each other's experience and grow stronger together. Don't forget to subscribe for more honest, thought-provoking stories. Life is complicated, but together we can face its challenges, one story at a time. Till I see you again in my next story. Goodbye.